I can still feel the rain from that night. It wasn't the kind of rain that announces itself with thunder or drama. It was quiet, persistent, the kind that soaks through your clothes before you realize you're getting wet. I stood in that narrow alley behind Murphy's Tavern, watching droplets cling to the flickering neon sign above us, and tried to make sense of what had just happened. Nathaniel's knuckles were bleeding. I kept staring at them, at the way the red mixed with the rainwater running down his fingers. His hands were shaking, though I couldn't tell if it was from adrenaline or cold. He hadn't looked at me since we'd stumbled out of the bar. Just stood there with his shoulders rigid, chest rising and falling like he'd been running. But we hadn't been running. We'd been fighting. Or rather, he had been fighting. I had been pressed against a brick wall, watching in stunned silence as Nathaniel threw his fist into Danny Morrison's jaw. The whole thing felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold in slow motion. Nathaniel had always been the one to tease me. For 8 years, he perfected the art of cutting me down with perfectly timed jokes, always in front of others, always with that sharp smile that made my chest tighten in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. He called me soft. He made fun of my cardigans, my quiet voice, the way I brought the same sad sandwich to lunch every day. It was our ritual, this dance of his casual cruelty and my practiced indifference. So when he stepped between me and Danny's group of drunk idiots, when he told them they didn't get to talk to me like that, I couldn't process it. My brain kept trying to rewrite the scene, to make it make sense. This was Nathaniel, the same man who had spent our entire friendship finding new ways to highlight everything that made me different, everything that made me easy to dismiss. I could still hear the echoes from inside the bar. The retirement party had been winding down, the air thick with cheap beer and forced camaraderie. I'd only come out of obligation, the way you show up to things when absence would be more noticeable than presence. I'd been nursing the same warm beer for 2 hours, counting down the minutes until I could politely escape. The jokes had started innocent enough. Someone mentioned my sweater, the cable-knit cardigan my sister had given me for Christmas. Then Danny chimed in about my voice, doing an exaggerated impression that made the others laugh. I was used to it. I had developed a thick skin over the years, learned to smile and shrug and wait for the attention to move elsewhere. But something had felt different that night. The edges were sharper. The laughter had a mean quality that cut deeper than usual. And Nathaniel, who normally would have joined in, who would have added his own perfectly crafted barb to the pile, had gone quiet. I'd noticed him watching from across the room, his expression unreadable. When Danny started in about my personal life, about how I was 33 and still single, about how maybe there was a reason I kept to myself so much, I felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up my neck. The group was getting louder, emboldened by alcohol and the pack mentality that turns grown men into playground bullies. Someone made a joke about checking my pulse to see if I was still alive. Another suggested maybe I just needed to get laid, though he used cruder language that made my stomach turn. I was already planning my exit, already calculating how to slip away without drawing more attention, when Nathaniel appeared beside me. Not to join in, as I'd expected, but to stand close enough that I could smell his cologne, close enough that his presence felt like a shield. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Danny looked confused, like he was trying to figure out if Nathaniel was setting up an even better punchline. The others watched with the eager anticipation of spectators waiting for blood. But Nathaniel didn't deliver a punchline. He didn't smile that sharp smile or add fuel to their fire. Instead, he said something quiet to Danny, something I couldn't hear over the noise of the bar. Danny's expression shifted from confusion to irritation, then to something darker. That's when things escalated. Danny pushed Nathaniel back, not hard, but enough to make his intentions clear. Someone shouted something about minding his own business. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches, and I found myself pressed against the wall, trying to become invisible as voices rose around me. I'd never seen Nathaniel fight before. He was always so controlled, so measured in everything he did. But when Danny grabbed my shoulder, when he leaned in close and said things I don't want to remember, something in Nathaniel snapped. The beer bottle hit the floor with a crash that seemed to silence everything else. Then Nathaniel's fist connected with Danny's face, and suddenly we were in the middle of chaos. The bartender was shouting. Someone was pulling them apart. Chairs scraped against the floor as people either scrambled away or pressed closer to get a better view. In the confusion, Nathaniel grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the back exit, and before I knew it, We were outside in the alley, in the rain, trying to catch our breath. Now we stood in the strange intimacy of shared silence, neither of us sure what to say about what had just happened. The neon sign buzzed overhead, casting everything in alternating red and blue light. I could hear muffled voices from inside the bar, probably discussing what they'd just witnessed. My shoulder still ached where Danny had grabbed it. Nathaniel finally looked at me, and I saw something in his expression I'd never seen before. Not the usual amusement or irritation or casual indifference. Something raw and unguarded, like a door had been left open and I was seeing into a room I wasn't supposed to know existed. He said my name, just once, like he was testing how it sounded in this new context. Like he was trying to figure out who we were now, after this moment that had rewritten 8 years of careful distance. I wanted to ask him why. Why he'd stepped in. Why he'd defended me when he'd spent so long tearing me down. Why his hands were still shaking. Why he looked like he was seeing me for the first time. But I didn't ask any of those things. Instead, I stood there in the rain, watching the blood wash from his knuckles, and felt something shift between us. Something fundamental and irreversible, like a crack in a foundation that changes the entire structure of a building. The night air was cold against my skin, but I didn't feel cold. I felt suspended, caught between who we'd been 5 minutes ago and who we might become. Everything felt different now. The way he was looking at me. The way the silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility instead of awkwardness. When he finally spoke again, his voice was different too. Softer than I'd ever heard it, uncertain in a way that made my chest tighten. He said he was sorry, though I wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. The fight, maybe. Or the 8 years before it. Or the fact that everything between us had just changed in ways neither of us fully understood yet. I told him it was okay, but that wasn't quite right either. Nothing about this was okay in the conventional sense. But it was something else. Something that felt like the beginning of a conversation we'd been avoiding for years. We stood there until the rain started coming down harder, until staying outside became impossible to justify. But even as we finally moved toward the street, toward whatever came next, I knew we weren't the same people who had walked into that bar hours earlier. Something had been spoken in that alley, in the space between his bloodied knuckles and my stunned silence. Something that couldn't be unsaid or forgotten or dismissed as just another night that got out of hand. I could still feel it as we walked away, that moment when everything changed. When Nathaniel stopped being the person who hurt me and became, instead, the person who protected me. When the distance between us collapsed into something I didn't have words for yet, but could feel settling into my bones like certainty. The night it changed. That's how I think of it now, looking back. The night when 8 years of careful choreography gave way to something real and messy and true. The night when I stopped pretending I didn't feel what I felt, and he stopped pretending he didn't feel it too. To understand why that night mattered so much, you have to understand the lies we built before it. The careful routines, the safe distances, the way we learned to exist in the same space without ever really touching. I was 33 then, teaching 7th grade English at Lincoln Middle School. It wasn't glamorous work, but it suited me. There's something honest about 13-year-olds. They haven't learned to hide their emotions yet, haven't perfected the art of saying one thing while meaning another. When they're excited about a book, you see it in their whole bodies. When they're struggling, it shows in their slumped shoulders and averted eyes. My apartment reflected the life I built around that honesty. One bedroom in a neighborhood that was halfway through gentrification, where coffee shops with exposed bricks sat next to bodegas that had been there for decades. I'd furnished it with pieces that told stories, a worn leather armchair from an estate sale, bookshelves made from reclaimed wood, art I'd found at weekend markets. Nothing matched exactly, but it all fit together in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. The plants were another story. I had a tendency to overwater them, to hover and fuss until their roots rotted from too much attention. It was a habit that extended beyond gardening, this impulse to love things too carefully, too cautiously. My sister always said I was afraid of taking up space, and maybe she was right. I learned early that being quiet, being accommodating, being forgettable was safer than being seen. On my desk at school sat a framed photo of my niece, Emma, gap-toothed and grinning in her soccer uniform. She was 8 then, all elbows and enthusiasm, and she had this way of looking at the world like it was full of possibilities. Sometimes I'd catch myself staring at that photo during lunch breaks, wondering what it would be like to carry that kind of confidence into adulthood. On my refrigerator Something having finally clicked into place. A recognition that we'd crossed a threshold we couldn't uncross, and neither of us wanted to. He walked me to my car, his hand finding mine as we moved through the parking lot, fingers intertwining with the kind of natural ease that suggested this contact was something we'd been denying ourselves rather than something new. The gesture felt both momentous and utterly right, like our hands had been designed to fit together this way. At my car door, he kissed me again, softer this time, more certain. Less like a question and more like a statement of intention. When he pulled back, his smile was different than any I'd seen from him before. Unguarded, genuine, touched with wonder at what we'd finally allowed ourselves to discover. "Drive safely," he said, and the ordinary words carried extraordinary weight, like they were code for everything we hadn't learned how to say yet. I watched him walk to his own car, watched him turn back to look at me before getting in, watched his taillights disappear down the street. But even after he was gone, I could still feel the warmth where his hand had touched my face, could still taste the sweetness of his mouth, could still feel the fundamental shift in everything I thought I understood about my life. Something had changed irrevocably under that streetlight. The careful choreography we'd maintained for so long had given way to something real and immediate and undeniable. Whatever came next would have to be navigated without the safety net of pretense, without the comfortable distance that had protected us both from having to examine what we actually meant to each other. As I drove home through the quiet streets, I carried with me the knowledge that everything was different now, that the wall between us hadn't just cracked, but had been completely dismantled, leaving us exposed to possibilities that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The night had started with children's voices raised in song, with the simple joy of young people sharing something beautiful with their families. It had ended with two adults finally admitting, without words, that they'd been circling around each other for years, too afraid to name what they were feeling, too careful to risk what they'd built for the chance of something more. But now we'd risked it. Now we knew. And there was no going back to the safety of not knowing. No returning to the careful dance of almosts and maybes that had sustained us for so long. Everything was different now. Everything was possible. And for the first time in years, that possibility felt like something to embrace rather than something to fear. After the kiss, we entered a strange new territory that had no map, no established rules, no clear boundaries to guide us. We began seeing each other quietly, carefully, like two people learning to walk on ice that might crack beneath our feet at any moment. There were no labels for what we were doing, no discussions about what it meant or where it might lead. Just presence. Just the simple, revolutionary act of choosing each other's company without the armor of professional distance. The Thursday evening grading sessions at my apartment transformed into something entirely different. Nathaniel would still arrive at 6:30 with takeout, but now there was an awareness in the air that made everything feel charged with possibility. We'd spread our papers across the coffee table as we always had, but our attention wandered more easily, drawn to the space between us on the couch, to the casual touches that were no longer accidental. Sometimes we'd abandon the pretense of work entirely. I'd look up from a stack of essays to find him watching me with that expression I was learning to recognize, wonder mixed with something deeper, more complicated. He'd reach across the small distance between us to touch my hand, to trace the line of my jaw with his fingertips, to pull me closer until I was tucked against his side like I belonged there. These moments felt both natural and miraculous, like we were discovering something that had always existed but had been hidden beneath years of careful performance. The ease with which we fitted together physically mirrored the emotional intimacy we'd been building for months, but now it could finally be acknowledged, explored, celebrated. One evening in late April, after we'd finished our work and were sitting close on the couch, Nathaniel laid his head on my chest with a sigh that seemed to release tension I hadn't realized he'd been carrying. We didn't speak. We just breathed together, his weight warm and solid against me, my hand finding its way to his hair without conscious thought. In those quiet moments, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The constant low-level anxiety that had been my baseline for most of my adult life seemed to quiet when he was near. His presence made my apartment feel different. Not just less empty, but more like home. More like a place where genuine life could happen rather than just the careful maintenance of solitary existence. We took walks after school sometimes, choosing routes through neighborhoods where we were unlikely to encounter colleagues or students. These excursions felt like small rebellions, like we were claiming time and space that had always existed but we'd never dared to occupy together. We'd talk about our days, about books we were reading, about memories from before we knew each other, about dreams we'd stopped allowing ourselves to voice. There was something intoxicating about this new freedom to be ourselves with each other, to drop the careful personas we maintained at work and exist as simply ourselves. I discovered that Nathaniel without his professional armor was funnier, more vulnerable, prone to moments of unexpected tenderness that took my breath away. He told me about the poetry he'd written in college, about his fear of ending up like his father, about the way certain pieces of music could make him cry if he listened when he was feeling too much. I shared things I'd never told anyone, about the loneliness that had shaped most of my adult choices, about the way I'd learned to make myself invisible as a survival strategy, about the dreams I'd deferred because they seemed too risky, too likely to end in disappointment. He listened with the kind of attention that felt like a gift, like he was memorizing details that mattered to him. But even as we grew closer, even as the intimacy between us deepened in ways that felt both inevitable and miraculous, there was always the weight of secrecy pressing at the edges of our happiness. We existed in stolen moments, in carefully managed encounters, in the spaces between our public lives where we could finally be honest about what we meant to each other. The secrecy became its own kind of prison. I found myself lying to Sarah when she asked about my weekend plans, making up solitary activities to explain my unavailability. When colleagues invited me to after-work gatherings, I had to manufacture excuses that became increasingly elaborate as the months passed. Every social interaction required careful calculation, constant awareness of what I could and couldn't say. The weight of hiding felt heavier than I'd expected. I'd been protecting my privacy for years, but this was different. This wasn't just keeping personal information to myself. This was actively concealing something that had become the most important part of my life. Every conversation felt like a performance. Every casual question about my social life felt like a trap I had to navigate carefully. Nathaniel seemed to handle the secrecy more easily, or at least more quietly. He'd always been private, expert at deflecting personal questions with humor or strategic redirection. But I noticed the way he'd shut down when I tried to talk about the future, about what we were building together, about what came next. "Let's just stay here," he said one evening when I'd tentatively suggested we might attend the school's spring festival together, not as colleagues, but as whatever we were becoming. His fingers were tracing circles on my hand, a gesture that had become habitual when he was processing something complicated. "I don't want to think about anything beyond this room, this moment." I understood the impulse. The present felt safe, contained, manageable. But I was beginning to realize that the constant vigilance required to maintain our secret was wearing on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd spent my whole life being careful, being invisible, protecting myself from exposure. But being with Nathaniel was making me want something different, something braver. The moment of crisis came, as these things often do, from an unexpected direction. It was a Monday morning faculty meeting, the kind of routine gathering where announcements were made and administrative details were discussed. I was half listening to the principal's updates about standardized testing schedules when I noticed heads turning, whispered conversations starting and stopping, the particular kind of attention that signals gossip beginning to circulate. After the meeting, as teachers filtered back to their classrooms, Linda Morrison from the art department approached me with the carefully neutral expression that people wear when they're about to deliver uncomfortable news. "Caleb," she said, touching my arm gently, "I just wanted you to know that there's been some talk. Someone mentioned seeing you and Nathaniel together outside of school. It's probably nothing, but I thought you should be aware." My stomach dropped, that familiar cocktail of fear and shame flooding my system before I could think to control it. I managed to thank Linda for the heads up, to maintain the appropriate level of casual confusion about what anyone might have seen or why it would matter. But internally, I was spiraling through all the possibilities, all the ways our careful secrecy might have been compromised. The day passed in a haze of hypervigilance. Every conversation seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every glance felt like scrutiny. When the principal's secretary appeared at my classroom door during lunch with a request for me to stop by the office at my convenience, I knew our time was up. Principal Rodriguez was a fair man, someone I'd always respected for his ability to balance the competing demands of administration with genuine care for both students and faculty. When I knocked on his door that afternoon, he greeted me with the kind of studied casualness that confirmed my worst fears. "Caleb," he said, settling behind his desk with the weary expression of someone about to navigate delicate territory, "I've had a parent contact me with some concerns. Nothing specific, just questions about professional boundaries and appropriate relationships between faculty members." He paused, clearly hoping I would fill the silence with explanations or denials that would make this conversation easier for both of us. When I remained quiet, he continued, "I'm not asking for details about your personal life," he said carefully, "but if there's anything you think I should know, anything that might affect your professional standing or the school's reputation, I'd appreciate the opportunity to address it proactively." I felt the weight of every choice I'd made over the past months, every moment of happiness I'd stolen, every risk I'd taken in allowing myself to want something that felt too good to be sustainable. The familiar voice in my head whispered that this was what I'd been afraid of all along. The reason I'd learned to make myself small, to want less, to expect disappointment rather than joy. I told Principal Rodriguez that I understood his concerns and would certainly let him know if any issues arose that affected my professional responsibilities. It was a careful non-answer, the kind of bureaucratic deflection that I'd perfected over years of protecting my privacy. He seemed satisfied, or at least willing to accept my response as sufficient for the moment. But walking back to my classroom, I felt something cracking inside me. The careful structures I'd built to protect myself, the habits of secrecy and self-denial that had defined most of my adult life, suddenly felt unbearable. I'd found something real, something that made me feel more alive than I'd ever been, and I was being asked to hide it like it was shameful, like it was something to be managed rather than celebrated. That evening, when Nathaniel arrived at my apartment with Chinese food and his usual uncertain smile, I couldn't pretend that everything was normal. I told him about the faculty meeting, about the whispered conversations, about my meeting with the principal. I watched his face change as he processed the implications, saw the familiar barriers start to rise in his expression. "Maybe we should be more careful," he said, setting down the takeout containers without opening them. "Take a break until things settle down." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. After everything we'd shared, everything we'd discovered together, his first instinct was retreat, concealment, return to the careful distance that had defined our relationship for so many years. "I can't do this anymore," I said, the words escaping before I'd fully formed the thought. "I can't keep hiding. I can't keep pretending that the most important thing in my life doesn't exist." Nathaniel's jaw tightened, that familiar defensive posture I recognized from 8 years of watching him navigate difficult conversations. "And what if I'm not ready?" he asked. "What if I'm not ready to have my personal life become public discussion, to deal with whatever comes next?" I looked at him across my living room. This man I'd come to love despite every instinct that told me to protect myself from wanting too much. I saw the fear in his expression, the same terror of exposure that had governed my own choices for years. But I also saw something else, a weariness that mirrored my own, a recognition that the cost of hiding was becoming greater than the risk of being seen. "I spent my whole life making myself small," I said quietly, accepting less than I wanted because it felt safer. "I won't go back to that. Not even for this." The silence that followed felt enormous, heavy with the weight of everything we weren't saying. I could see him processing my words, understanding that I was offering him a choice, but also drawing a line that I wouldn't cross again. That whatever we built from here would have to be built on honesty rather than secrecy, on courage rather than fear. We sat in the dark for what felt like hours, neither of us willing to be the first to speak, to break whatever spell might still be holding us together. The takeout containers sat unopened on the coffee table, growing cold while we tried to figure out whether we were brave enough to choose each other despite the costs, whether what we'd found was worth the risk of losing everything we'd carefully constructed to protect ourselves. Finally, barely audible, Nathaniel spoke. "I don't want to lose you." The words hung in the air between us, honest and desperate and more vulnerable than anything he'd ever shared with me. I turned to look at him, saw the fear and longing warring in his expression, saw him choosing to be brave despite every instinct that told him to retreat. "Then don't," I said simply. It wasn't a dramatic moment, wasn't accompanied by grand gestures or passionate declarations. But it was a choice, made in the quiet darkness of my living room, to stop hiding from what we meant to each other. To accept that love, when it's real, requires courage that goes beyond the safety of secrecy. Whatever came next would be uncertain, complicated, probably difficult in ways we couldn't anticipate. But we would face it together, honestly, without the exhausting performance of pretending we were something other than what we'd become. In the darkness, Nathaniel reached for my hand, and I felt the weight of 8 years of careful distance finally lift. We'd crossed the threshold from secret to truth, from hidden to visible, from fear to whatever came after fear, when you finally found something worth the risk of losing everything else. The choice was made. Everything that followed would be built on that foundation, not of certainty, but of courage, not of safety, but of truth, not of hiding, but of finally being seen. A month later, a new photo appeared on my refrigerator. Nothing dramatic or intentionally significant, just the two of us sitting on a park bench, laughing at something I couldn't even remember now. Sarah had taken it during one of those Sunday afternoons when we'd all met for coffee, back when the weather was still cool enough to sit outside without wilting. I hadn't asked for the photo, hadn't even known she was taking it. But when she texted it to me later that week with a message about how happy I looked, I found myself printing it out and hanging it next to the grocery lists and school reminders that accumulated on my kitchen bulletin board. There was something about seeing us together, captured in a moment of unguarded joy, that felt like evidence of something real and sustainable. We still didn't tell everyone. There wasn't a grand announcement or a dramatic coming out. No faculty meeting where we declared our intentions or changed our relationship status on social media accounts we didn't really maintain anyway. Instead, we simply stopped hiding. Stopped manufacturing separate plans when colleagues invited us to gatherings. Stopped pretending we didn't know each other's weekend schedules, didn't share meals, didn't spend most of our free time in each other's company. The shift was subtle enough that some people probably didn't notice immediately. But gradually, our coworkers began to adjust their assumptions, to include us both in invitations, to stop asking about our dating lives with the concerned persistence that single people endure from well-meaning friends. We became a unit in people's minds without ever having to explain what kind of unit we were. At school, we maintained most of our professional boundaries. We still arrived separately, still kept our classroom interactions focused on work, still participated in meetings and committees with the same collegial distance we'd always displayed. But the performance aspect was gone. We weren't pretending not to care about each other anymore. We were simply choosing when and how to let that care be visible. The evenings became something entirely different. Nathaniel would appear at my door around 6, often with ingredients for dinner, sometimes with a bottle of wine, always with the particular expression of someone coming home rather than visiting. We'd established new routines without discussing them, small rituals that marked the transition from our public selves to something more authentic. He cooked more than I did, a skill I hadn't known he possessed during all those years of wondering what he did with his time outside school. I'd watch him move around my kitchen with increasing familiarity, learning where I kept things, understanding the quirks of my ancient stove, making himself comfortable in ways that transformed the space from my apartment into our space. After dinner, we'd settle on the couch with books or papers, our legs tangled together while we read. I'd gotten into the habit of reading aloud when I found passages that struck me as particularly beautiful or insightful, and Nathaniel would listen with the kind of attention that made me feel like my voice was something worth hearing. Sometimes he'd interrupt with observations or questions that turned our reading into conversation, thoughts building on thoughts until we'd spent hours exploring ideas that had started with a single sentence. The teasing that had defined our relationship for so long didn't disappear entirely, but it changed, softened, became something more playful than cutting, more affectionate than defensive. Where it had once been armor, protection against getting too close, it was now a language we'd developed together, a way of expressing fondness that acknowledged our history while embracing what we'd become. He still noticed everything. My tendency to overwater plants, my habit of wearing cardigans even when the weather was warm, the way I'd rearrange my bookshelves when I was anxious. But his observations came wrapped in tenderness now, gentle acknowledgement rather than pointed commentary. When he mentioned that I'd alphabetized my spice rack, there was love in his voice instead of ammunition. I found myself more comfortable with his attention, less defensive about the ways he saw me. The hypervigilance that had characterized most of my adult relationships relaxed into something that felt sustainable, healthy. I could be myself around him without constantly monitoring his reactions, without calculating whether my authentic responses were safe or acceptable. One evening in early summer, when the air conditioning was struggling against an unusually warm day, and we'd abandoned any pretense of productivity in favor of cold drinks and lazy conversation, I found a note tucked into the book I was reading. Nathaniel's handwriting, careful and deliberate. You were never the joke. I just didn't know how to love you out loud. I stared at the words for a long time, feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. All those years of wondering whether his attention was genuine or performed, whether his interest was kind or cruel, whether I was someone worth caring about, or just a convenient target for entertainment. The note answered questions I'd been afraid to ask, provided reassurance I hadn't known I still needed. When I looked up, he was watching me with that expression I'd learned meant he was nervous about how I'd receive something he'd shared. I didn't say anything, just reached across the space between us and kissed him softly, letting the gesture carry what words felt too small to express. Outside, summer rain began tapping against the windows with the irregular rhythm of weather that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be a drizzle or a storm. The sound was soothing, creating a sense of enclosure that made my apartment feel even more like a refuge from the world's demands and expectations. Inside, we sat close in the growing quiet of evening, no longer performing for each other or for an imagined audience of people who might judge our choices. No armor, no careful distance, no strategic withholding of affection or attention. Just presence. Just the simple revolutionary act of existing honestly in the same space, letting ourselves be seen completely by someone who had chosen to stay despite knowing all our carefully hidden vulnerabilities. I thought about all the years I'd spent making myself smaller, safer, less visible. All the desires I'd deferred, the risks I'd avoided, the connections I'd prevented because they felt too dangerous to my carefully constructed peace. The loneliness I'd accepted as the price of protection, the way I'd learned to want less because less felt manageable. But this, sitting with Nathaniel while rain painted patterns on the windows, his hand warm against my shoulder, both of us reading in comfortable silence. This felt like breathing freely for the first time in years. Like I'd been holding my breath without realizing it. And finally, I could exhale. The photo on my refrigerator caught the kitchen light as I got up to refill our water glasses. Two people laughing together on a park bench, unaware they were being captured, but comfortable enough with each other to be photographed in a moment of genuine joy. That's what we'd become. People who could be happy without performing happiness, who could love without fear of the consequences, who could exist together authentically rather than carefully. When I returned to the living room, Nathaniel had set aside his book and was watching the rain with the peaceful expression of someone who had nowhere else he needed to be. I settled beside him, fitting against his side with the easy familiarity we'd developed, and felt the particular contentment that comes from being exactly where you belong. We didn't need to talk about the future anymore, didn't need to define what we were or make plans that stretched too far ahead. The present was sufficient. This moment, this quiet evening, This simple act of choosing each other's company again and again until it became as natural as breathing. Outside, the rain continued its gentle percussion against glass and leaves and pavement, washing the world clean. Inside, two men who had spent years circling each other finally sat still, finally stopped pretending they didn't understand what they'd found, finally allowed themselves to rest in the knowledge that love, when it's real, doesn't require performance or perfection or protection from its own existence. The night settled around us like a blanket, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt completely at peace with who I was and where I belonged. The careful choreography of our early years had given way to something much simpler and infinitely more precious. The quiet comfort of being known, being chosen, being loved exactly as we were rather than as who we thought we should be. Finally, I could breathe freely. Finally, we both could.